In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a gunshot shatters the peace. Reginald Hawthorne is dead, his company ledger vanished. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and knitting needles, unravels a web of secrets, a nervous accountant hiding, embezzlement, an ambitious partner craving control, a loyal clerk guarding the truth, a bitter rival with a grudge, and a widow whose love turned deadly. As clues emerge, a smudged window, a missing glove, a burned ledger Miss Marple sets. A trap, revealing a chilling betrayal that restores the village's calm, one stitch at a time. Chapter 1. The shadow of suspicion. The late afternoon sun cast long, dappled shadows across the cobbled lanes of St. Mary Mead, where the air carried the faint scent of honeysuckle and the promise of an uneventful evening. In her modest cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking in a rhythm as steady as the village clock. Her eyes, sharp and bright despite her years, flickered occasionally to the Tonya's cottage, where a curtain of climbing roses framed the view. The world beyond seemed at peace, but Miss Marple knew better beneath the surface of any village. Secrets stirred like currents in a quiet stream. The tranquility was shattered by a sharp knock at the door. Lily, the young maid, bustled in, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard? It's dreadful. Mr. Hawthorne's been found dead in his study at the manor, shot clean through the head, and the company ledgers gone. Missing, they say." Miss Marple's needles paused, her serene expression unchanged, but her mind already turning. "Reginald Hawthorne, you say? How very shocking, Lily. Tell me, what are they saying in the village?" Lily, eager to share, perched on the edge of a chair. "They're saying it's murder, Miss. The police are up at the manor now, and Inspector Craddock's asking questions, for folks are in the thick of it, so I heard Mr. Caldwell, the accountant, Mr. Blake, the partner, Miss Finch, the clerk, and that Mr. Grayson from the next town over, who's always been at odds with Mr. Hawthorne. Oh, it's a right scandal." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her thoughts darting to the names. Ernest Caldwell, a nervous, meticulous man. Lionel. Blake, smooth and ambitious. Clara Finch, quiet and loyal. And Victor Grayson, a bullish rival with a grudge. A ledger missing, a man dead, and 4 suspects a puzzle worthy of her attention. "Murder is a terrible thing, Lily," she said softly, her needles resuming their dance. "But truth has a way of surfacing, like a stone in a sifted pan." As Lily chattered on, Miss Marple's mind wandered to the Hawthorne Manor, a grand, Georgian house on the edge of the village, its tall windows and clipped hedges masking the tensions within. She recalled Reginald Hawthorne, a stern man with a reputation for shrewd dealings, not always kind but respected. His death, she sensed, was no simple tragedy. The ledger's disappearance suggested a deeper motive, one rooted in secrets only. Numbers could tell. Setting her knitting aside, Miss Marple rose, smoothing her lavender skirt. "I shall pay my respects to Mrs. Hawthorne tomorrow, Lily. A widow needs comfort in such times." But her true purpose was clear to observe, to listen, to unravel the threads of this dark affair. She recalled a similar incident years ago, when a missing account book in St. Mary Mead had revealed a betrayal no one suspected. People she knew were rarely what they seemed, as the evening bells tolled. Miss Marple stepped outside, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders. The village was abuzz, small knots of neighbours whispering near the post office and the Blue Boar Inn. She caught snippets of speculation money troubles, a jealous rival, a disgruntled employee. Her eyes, keen as ever, noted the uneasy glances cast toward the manor. St. Mary Mead might appear a sleepy hamlet, but Miss Marple knew its heartbeat with hidden passions and silent grudges. The shadow of suspicion had fallen, and she intended to follow its trail. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village as Miss Jane Marple made her way along the winding path to Hawthorne Manor. Her black lace-up shoes tapped lightly on the gravel, and her gloved hands clasped a basket of homemade scones, a pretext for her visit to the grieving widow, Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and inquisitive behind her spectacles, took in the familiar sights: the butcher's shop with its gleaming window, the post office where Mrs. Bantry was, no doubt, already spreading the latest gossip, and the church spire piercing the low clouds. But her thoughts were fixed on the manor ahead, where a man lay dead and a ledger had vanished, leaving a trail of questions as tangled as the ivy on the manor's walls. Hawthorne Manor stood at the edge of the village, its Georgian facade imposing, yet weathered as if the weight of its secrets had begun to wear at its stones. The iron gates creaked as Miss Marple pushed them open, her steps deliberate but unhurried. She noted the gardener, old Tompkins, raking leaves with a distracted air, his usual chatter silenced by the shadow of tragedy. The front door was answered by a pale housemaid, whose red-rimmed eyes suggested tears shed in private. "Mrs. Hawthorne is in the drawing-room, miss," she murmured, leading the way through a hall adorned with sombre portraits and a ticking grandfather clock. Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne sat by a low fire, her black morning dress stark against the room's faded elegance. She was a woman of middle years, her auburn hair streaked with grey, her face drawn but composed. Miss Marple, offering her condolences with practiced gentleness, set the basket of scones on a side table and took a seat, her posture as upright as her resolve. "Such a dreadful loss, my dear," she said, her voice soft but carrying a note of quiet authority. "The village is quite shaken." Beatrice nodded, her fingers twisting a lace handkerchief. "It's unbearable, Miss Marple. Reginald was everything to this house, to the business, and now, with the ledger gone—" Her voice faltered, and she glanced toward the window, as if expecting an answer from the mist beyond. Miss Marple's eyes followed hers, noting the flicker of unease. "The ledger, yes. A curious thing to go missing. I suppose it held the firm's secrets, as ledgers often do." Beatrice's lips tightened, but she said nothing, offering only a vague murmur about the police investigation. Miss Marple did not press, instead letting the silence work its subtle magic. She had learned long ago that people often revealed more in their pauses than in their words. As Beatrice busied herself with the tea tray, Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the room's details: the heavy velvet curtains, the polished mahogany table, a faint scuff on the rug near the door, as if someone had paced there repeatedly. The house, she sensed, was holding its breath. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, a solid, earnest man with a face that suggested he trusted facts more than intuition. He greeted Miss Marple with a polite nod, though his eyes held a trace of wariness. He knew her reputation for meddling helpfully, but meddling nonetheless. "Miss Marple didn't expect to see you here," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. "Just came to ask Mrs. Hawthorne a few more questions, if she's up to it." "Of course, Inspector," Beatrice said, her voice steadier now. "Anything to help find who did this." Miss Marple, sensing an opportunity, asked if she might see the study where the tragedy occurred. claiming a wish to pay her respects in the place where Mr. Hawthorne had spent so many hours. Craddock hesitated, then agreed, perhaps hoping her presence would keep Mrs. Hawthorne calm. The three of them moved through the hall, past a staircase where a maid scurried out of sight, and into the study-room of dark wood and heavy air, where the scent of old paper and cigar smoke lingered. The study was a scene of controlled chaos. Papers were strewn across a massive oak desk, its drawers ajar, one clearly forced open with a splintered edge. A leather chair, its cushion still bearing the imprint of its last occupant, faced a tall window that overlooked the garden. The window was slightly ajar, its latch gleaming as if recently polished. A chalk outline on the floor marked where Reginald Hawthorne's body had been found, a stark reminder of the violence that had shattered the room's order. The pistol, Craddock explained, had been removed for evidence, but it had been a small, unremarkable weapon, wiped clean of fingerprints. No sign of the ledger, I take it? Miss Marple asked, her tone deceptively casual as she adjusted her spectacles. None, Craddock replied, his brow furrowing. We've searched every inch of this room and the house. It's as if it vanished into thin air. But a ledger doesn't just walk off, does it? Someone took it, and I'd wager they had a reason. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the room with the precision of a seamstress measuring cloth. She noted the fireplace, its embers cold, but a faint smear of ash on the hearth, as if something had been disturbed. A bookshelf, crammed with ledgers and files, showed gaps where volumes had been hastily removed or misaligned. The rug, thick and Persian, bore faint indentations near the desk, suggesting heavy footsteps. But it was the window that drew her attention, most a smudge on the sill, barely visible, as if someone had gripped it while climbing through. Too high for a casual intruder, she thought, and too deliberate for a servant's carelessness. Was the window open when you arrived, Inspector? She asked, her voice mild. Wide open, Craddock said, but the latch wasn't forced, and the ground outside shows no clear footprints. The rain last night didn't help. If someone came through, they knew what they were doing. Miss Marple stepped closer to the window, her fingers brushing the sill. The smudge was faint, a mix of dirt and something waxy shoe polish, perhaps. She filed the observation away, her mind already weaving possibilities. A locked room, a missing ledger, a clean pistol-leech detail was a thread in a tapestry she was only beginning to discern. Mrs. Hawthorne, standing by the door, seemed reluctant to enter the room fully. Reginald spent so many hours here, she said, her voice catching. He was always working, always checking that ledger. He said it was the heart of the business. And who else had access to it? Miss Marple asked gently, her eyes still on the window. Only Ernest Mr. Caldwell. The accountant tanned, sometimes Clara, the clerk. Lionel, his partner, would look at it now and then, but Reginald was particular. He didn't trust Isley. Beatrice's words were careful, but Miss Marple caught the slight emphasis on trust, a hint of something unspoken. Craddock, flipping through his notebook, added, We've spoken to them all. Caldwell says he was in his office, working late. Blake was in London, dining with clients. Miss Finch was with her mother, who's ill, and Grayson, the rival, claims he was at his warehouse. None of their stories are airtight, but nothing solid pins any of them yet. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the suspects. Ernest Caldwell, with his nervous tics and ledger expertise. Lionel Blake, whose charm masked ambition. Clara Finch, quiet but fiercely loyal. And Victor Grayson, whose grudge against Hawthorne was no secret. Each had a reason to want the ledger gone, but murder, that required a deeper motive, one rooted in fear or greed or desperation. As they returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple paused by a sideboard, noticing a photograph of the Hawthorne family Reginald, stern and upright, Beatrice, smiling faintly, and a young man, their son, who had died years ago in a riding accident. The loss, she knew, had hardened Reginald, made him cling to his business as a lifeline. Perhaps that rigidity had sparked the fatal conflict over tea. Miss Marple steered the conversation to lighter topics, asking about the village fete and Mrs. Hawthorne's garden. But her eyes missed nothing, the way Beatrice's hands trembled. When mentioning the business, the quick glance toward the study door when Craddock spoke of the ledger. The widow knew something, Miss Marple was certain, but whether it was guilt or fear, she could not yet say, as she prepared to leave. Miss Marple lingered in the hall, her gaze falling on a coat rack where a man's scarf hung, its edge frayed. As if caught on something sharp, she thought of the window-sill, the smudge, the open latch. "You've been most kind, Mrs. Hawthorne," she said, her smile warm but her mind racing. "I'll call again soon. These things, they have a way of sorting themselves out." Outside, the mist had lifted, revealing the manor's gardens in crisp detail. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind sifting through the morning's observations. The study's disarray, the missing ledger, the smudge on the sill, they pointed to an inside job, someone familiar with the house's rhythms. She recalled a case from years ago when a stolen diary in St. Mary Mead had revealed a servant's betrayal. The clues hidden in overlooked details, scuff on a floor, a misplaced key. This, she sensed, was no different. The ledger was the key, not just to the murder, but to a secret someone was desperate to conceal. As she reached the village, Miss Marple passed the Blue Boar Inn, where a knot of locals whispered about the murder. She caught fragments of their talk rumours, of financial ruin, of Grayson's threats, of Caldwell's odd behaviour. She smiled faintly, knowing gossip was a crude tool, but often held grains of truth. The ledger's absence was no accident, she thought. It was the heart of the crime, and whoever held it destroyed it, had blood on their hands. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed, but her thoughts far from idle. The scene of the crime had spoken. To her, in its smudges and silences, its open window and forced drawer. The puzzle was taking shape, and she would follow its threads, one careful stitch at a time. St. Mary Mead might seem a quiet place, but Miss Marple knew its shadows held stories, and she was determined to read this one to its end. Chapter 3. The accountant's tale. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the vicarage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting resting in her lap. She had arranged to meet Mr. Ernest Caldwell, the accountant of Hawthorne and Sons, under the guise of discussing the village's charity accounts, a task she occasionally undertook to keep her finger on the pulse of St. Mary Mead's affairs. The vicarage, with its air of quiet respectability, was the perfect setting for such a conversation-neutral ground where tongues might loosen. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had kindly offered her parlour, bustling off with a tray of tea, things to give them privacy. Ernest Caldwell arrived promptly at 10. His slight frame hunched in a grey suit that seemed a size too large. His spectacles perched precariously on a thin nose, and his hands, clutching a leather satchel, twitched with a restlessness that Miss Marple noted at once. He was a man of perhaps 40, with a pallor that suggested long hours indoors, and a disposition that leaned toward anxiety. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice high and clipped, like a typewriter striking paper. "I hope I'm not late." "The charity accounts, ye said." "Oh, yes, Mr. Caldwell," Miss Marple replied, her smile as disarming as a summer breeze. "But there's no rush. Do sit down. Mrs. Clement's scones are quite excellent, and I find a cup of tea helps one think clearly." She poured from the pot, her movements deliberate, her eyes never straying far from his face. Caldwell sat, his satchel placed carefully at his feet, as if it contained state secrets rather than ledgers and pencils. He accepted the tea with a murmur of thanks, but his fingers drummed lightly on the cup's edge, betraying his unease. Miss Marple, stirring her own tea, began with innocuous questions about the charity funds, small donations, the cost of hymnals before steering the conversation toward Hawthorne and Sons. "Such a tragedy about poor Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her tone soft with sympathy. "And the ledger missing, too. It must be a great burden for you, managing the accounts without it." Caldwell's cup rattled slightly in its saucer. "A burden, yes," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "The ledger was essential, all. Our transactions, suppliers, debts, it was the firm's backbone. Without it, I'm at a loss." His eyes darted to the window where a sparrow flitted past, and Miss Marple noted the evasion in his glance. "But surely you kept copies, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked, her voice mild as milk. "A man as meticulous as yourself, I've heard you're quite the wizard with numbers." He flushed, a faint pink creeping up his sallow cheeks. "I did my best, Miss Marple, but Mr. Hawthorne was particular. He liked the original ledger, kept it in his study. I only had drafts in my office, and they're incomplete." His words came too quickly, as if rehearsed, and Miss Marple's mind flickered to a memory of young Tommy Pierce, a village lad who'd once stammered through an excuse for stealing apples, his guilt plain in his haste. She leaned forward slightly, her knitting needles clicking softly as she picked them up, the rhythm a soothing counterpoint to Caldwell's agitation. "It must be dreadful, working under such suspicion," she said. "The police, I hear, are quite thorough. They say you were in your office that night, working late." Yes, Caldwell said, his voice rising a fraction. "I was balancing the books. Routine work, you know. I left around 9, perhaps a bit later. The office is across the village, near the mill. No one saw me leave, but then it was a quiet night." His fingers tightened on the satchel, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. No one saw him a convenient alibi, but one that hung on the absence of witnesses rather than their presence. "And you didn't visit the manor that evening?" she asked, her tone as innocent as a child's. "I only ask because, well, village talk can be so unkind. Someone mentioned seeing a light in the manor's study late that night." Caldwell's face stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Village talk is nonsense," he said sharply, then caught himself, forcing a smile. "I mean, people imagine things. I was nowhere near the manor. My work keeps me busy enough without traipsing about at night." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle understanding, but her mind was cataloguing every nuance's defensive snap, the way his eyes avoided hers, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow despite the cool room. She recalled a case from years ago, when a shopkeeper's nervous fidgeting had betrayed his pilfering from the till. Caldwell's manner was not dissimilar, though the stakes here were far higher than a few shillings. Changing tack, she asked. About the firm's health, her questions framed as the curiosity of an old woman concerned for the village's prosperity. Hawthorne and Sons has always been a pillar of St. Mary Mead, she said. I suppose the ledger would show if all was well, or if, perhaps, there were difficulties. Caldwell hesitated, his fingers pausing their restless dance. The firm was sound, he said, his voice careful. Mr. Hawthorne was a cautious man. We had our challenges, raising costs, competition from Mr. Grayson, but nothing dire. The ledger would show that, if we had it. His tone was firm, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in his words, as if he were reciting a lesson. He hoped to believe. She sipped her tea, letting the silence stretch. Caldwell shifted in his seat, his satchel creaking as he adjusted it. You must know the ledger's contents quite well, she said at last, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. All those figures, all those secrets. It's a heavy responsibility, being the keeper of such things. His smile was strained, almost a grimace. It's my job, Miss Marple. Numbers don't lie, but they do require care. I did my best to keep things in order. He stood abruptly, clutching his satchel. I should be going. The charity accounts I'll have them ready by next week. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate. Of course, Mr. Caldwell, you've been most helpful, and do take care. These are troubling times. She watched him leave, his steps quick and uneven, as if fleeing an unseen pursuer. The vicarage door closed with a soft thud, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind alight with new threads. Caldwell's nervousness was no surprise, but its depth intrigued her. His alibi was flimsy, resting on solitude rather than corroboration, and his insistence on the firm's stability rang hollow. She thought of the smudge on the manor's window-sill, the forced drawer, the missing ledger. Caldwell's hands, she recalled, had been ink-stained, a detail that might mean nothing or everything. She remembered a village clerk years ago, whose trembling hands had betrayed his tampering with parish records. Numbers, as Caldwell said, did not lie, but men who wielded them often did. As she tidied the tea things, Mrs. Clement returned, her eyes bright with curiosity. Well, Miss Marple, did you get what you wanted from poor Mr. Caldwell? He looked positively rattled when he left. Miss Marple smiled, folding her knitting into her basket. People are so interesting, Mrs. Clement. They say one thing, but their manner tells another. Mr. Caldwell is a man with much on his mind, I think. She did not elaborate, but her thoughts were already turning to the next step. The manor's study, Caldwell's evasive answers. The ledger's absence, they formed a pattern, incomplete but emerging. She would need to see the others, Blake, Finch, Grayson, and test their stories against the silent evidence of the crime. As she stepped into the crisp air of St. Mary Mead, the village seemed to hum with its usual rhythm, children playing near the green, the baker's cart rattling by, the distant chime of the church bell. But Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the surface, a current of deceit ran deep, and she was determined to trace it to its source. The accountant's tale had been told, but it was only the beginning. A single stitch in a tapestry she would unravel with patience and precision. Chapter 4. The partner's ambition. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, gilding the thatched roofs and casting long shadows across the village green. Miss Jane Marple, her black straw hat tilted against the light, walked with measured steps toward the Blue Boar Inn, where she had arranged to meet Mr. Lionel Blake, the business partner of the late Reginald Hawthorne. Her pretext was simpler discussion about the village fetes funding, to which Hawthorne and Sons had been a generous contributor. But her true purpose was to observe Blake, whose polished charm and rumoured ambition had already piqued her interest. She carried her knitting bag, a familiar prop that disarmed even the wariest, and her mind was as sharp as the needles within. The Blue Boar's tap room was quiet, its oak beams and worn tables lending a cosy air despite the undercurrent of village gossip. Blake was already there, seated near a window, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the inn's rustic simplicity. He was a man in his early 40s, with dark hair slicked back and a smile that seemed to anticipate every conversation's turn. As Miss Marple approached, he rose, his handshake firm but his eyes appraising, as if measuring her for some unspoken challenge. "Miss Marple? A pleasure," he said, his voice smooth as polished brass. "I confess, I didn't expect to discuss fate budgets today, but I'm happy to help. Shall we?" He gestured to the table, where a pot of tea and a plate of biscuits awaited. No doubt ordered to set her at ease, Miss Marple settled into her chair, her smile as gentle as a spring breeze. "You're very kind, Mr. Blake. The fete is such a tradition here, and Mr. Hawthorne's support was always so appreciated. It's a pity, this dreadful business." She let the words hang, watching his reaction as she drew out her knitting, the soft click of needles punctuating the silence. Blake's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Dreadful, indeed," he said, leaning back with studied ease. "Reginald was a good man, if a bit set in his ways. The firm won't be the same without him, without Ledger, for that matter. A real mess for the business." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on her knitting but her attention fixed on his tone. "A ledger is such a vital thing," she said. "All those figures, telling the story of a company's fortunes. You must have relied on it, as Mr. Hawthorne's partner." "Oh, I left the numbers to Ernest Caldwell," Blake said, waving a hand. "My role was strategy, expansion. Reginald was cautious to cautious, if you ask me. We had opportunities to grow, to modernize, but he clung to old methods. We argued about it often." His tone was light, but Miss Marple caught the edge beneath it, a hint of frustration that bordered on resentment. "Arguments can be so trying," she said, her voice sympathetic. "I suppose you were in London that night, as the police mentioned. Away from all this trouble." Blake's smile returned, a touch too bright. "Yes, dining with clients at the Savoy. A late evening wine, contracts, the usual. I caught the last train back, got in around midnight. The police checked with the waiter, I believe. Solid as a rock, my alibi." He chuckled, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, as if the words were a shield he'd polished too often. She tilted her head, her needles pausing. "How fortunate to have such a clear account of your evening. Though I did hear village talk, you know that someone saw you near the manor earlier than midnight. A milkman, I think, mentioned a gentleman in a fine coat." Her tone was airy, almost apologetic, but her eyes were sharp, catching the flicker of surprise in his expression. Blake's chuckle was less convincing this time. "Village talk, Miss Marple, is as reliable as a summer storm. I was in London, as I said. Milkmen see shadows and call them men. I'm sure you understand how rumours twist." He sipped his tea, but his fingers gripped the cup a fraction too tightly. Miss Marple smiled, letting the matter drop. She turned the conversation to the fete, asking about sponsorships and stalls, but her mind was elsewhere, sifting through Blake's words. His alibi was strong, yet the milkman's, sighting confirmed by Mrs. Bantry's chatter at the post office, suggested he'd returned earlier. Why lie about the hour? unless to distance himself from the manor. She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead years ago, whose alibi for a theft had crumbled under the weight of a single witness's casual remark as they spoke. Miss Marple observed Blake's manner, the way he leaned forward to charm, his gestures calculated to disarm. He spoke of the firm's future with enthusiasm, outlining plans for new markets, modern machinery. Reginald didn't see the potential, he said, his voice warming. But now, well, we can move forward. A tragedy, of course, but an opportunity, too. An opportunity, Miss Marple echoed, her tone neutral. How forward-thinking. Though I imagine the missing ledger complicates things. Did you ever look at it yourself, Mr. Blake? He shrugged, his nonchalance a touch too studied, now and then, to check our margins. But Ernest handled the details. If there were issues, he'd have caught them. The man's a machine with numbers. His praise was generous, but Miss Marple caught a hint of disdain, as if Caldwell's precision was a quality Blake tolerated rather than admired. She shifted tack, asking about his relationship with Hawthorne. Blake admitted to frequent disagreements, always about the firm's direction. Reginald wanted to play it safe, keep things small. I saw us rivaling the big firms in London. We could have been giants, Miss Marple, but he wouldn't budge. His eyes gleamed with ambition, and Miss Marple noted it a hunger that might drive a man to extremes, though whether to murder, she could not yet say. As their conversation wound down, Blake stood, offering to walk her to the door. Miss Marple declined, citing a need to finish her tea, but her eyes followed him as he left, his stride confident but his shoulders tense. She thought of the manners study the open window, the forced drawer, the smudge on the sill. Blake's ambition was a motive, but his polished exterior suggested calculation, not the impulsiveness of a gunshot. Yet his lie about the time of his return nagged at her, a loose thread in an otherwise seamless story. She lingered in the tap-room, exchanging pleasantries with the innkeeper, who mentioned Blake's frequent trips to London, always in fine suits and with a spring in his step. A man going places, the innkeeper said, with a hint of admiration. Miss Marple smiled, but her thoughts were darker. Ambition, she knew, could be a quiet poison, seeping into the heart until it justified any act. She recalled a case from her youth, when a charming curate's drive for status had led to a betrayal that shocked the village. As she stepped into the fading light, Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side. The village was settling into evening, lamps glowing in cottage windows, but her mind was far from rest. Blake's ambition, Caldwell's nervousness, the ledger's absence, they were pieces of a puzzle, each with its own weight. She would need to see Clara Finch next, and perhaps Victor Grayson, to test their stories against Blake's. The truth, she knew, lay in the gaps between their words, and she would find it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 5. The Clerk's Devotion. The soft hum of St. Mary Mead's daily life enveloped Miss Jane Marple as she made her way to the village shop, a modest establishment where the scent of fresh bread mingled with the Thames of polished wood. It was mid-morning, and the shop was quiet, save for the occasional jingle of the bell above the door. Miss Marple's purpose was twofold: to purchase a skein of wool for her knitting and to speak with Miss Clara Finch, the clerk at Hawthorne and Sons, who often ran errands here for her ailing mother. The shop, with its shelves of tinned goods and jars of sweets, was a natural crossroads for village news, and Miss Marple knew Clara's presence would offer a chance to probe gently into the heart of the mystery. Clara, Finch was behind the counter. Her slender frame bent over a ledger knot, unlike the one missing from the manor, Miss Marple noted with a flicker of interest. Clara was young, barely 25, with a plain face softened by earnest brown eyes and a neat bun of chestnut hair. Her hands moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to order, but her expression held a trace of strain, as if the weight of recent events pressed heavily upon her. When she saw Miss Marple, she managed a small smile, though it did not reach her eyes. "Good morning, Miss Finch," Miss Marple said, her voice warm as she set her basket on the counter. "I was hoping to find you here. I need some wool blue, perhaps, for a scarf, but I also wanted to offer my sympathies. It must be so difficult, working at the firm after such a tragedy." Clara's hands paused on the ledger, her fingers tightening briefly. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said softly. "It's been hard. Mr. Hawthorne was kind to me, gave me a chance when no one else would, and now, with the ledger gone, it's all such a muddle." Her voice trembled, and she busied herself with fetching the wool, as if to hide her emotion. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle but observant. "A muddle, indeed. That ledger must have been quite important. I suppose you saw it often, working so closely with Mr. Hawthorne." Clara hesitated, her hands smoothing the skein of wool as if it were a talisman. "I did, sometimes. I typed up invoices and filed papers, but Mr. Hawthorne and Mr. Caldwell mostly handled the ledger. It was private, you know. Mr. Hawthorne trusted me, but he was careful about who saw the accounts." Her words were measured, but Miss Marple caught the slight catch in her voice, a hint of something held back. Settling into a chair near the counter, Miss Marple drew out her knitting, the familiar click of needles creating a soothing rhythm. "It's a comfort to know Mr. Hawthorne had such a loyal clerk," she said. "I've heard you were with your mother that night. Poor dear. It must be a trial, caring for her with all this going on." Clara's cheeks flushed, and she nodded. "Yes, I was home. Mother's been poorly, and I didn't leave her side. The neighbours saw Mrs. Price, next door, brought us some soup around 8. I couldn't have gone to the manor even if I'd wanted to." Her tone was firm, almost defiant, and Miss Marple noted the quick glance toward the shop door, as if expecting interruption. "How fortunate to have such good neighbours," Miss Marple said, her needles moving steadily. "Though I imagine you must worry about the firm. Without that ledger, things must be quite uncertain. Did you ever notice anything unusual in the accounts, perhaps?" Clara's hands froze, and for a moment her eyes met Miss Marple, wide with a flicker of fear. "Unusual," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not sure I should say Mr. Hawthorne trusted me to keep things confidential. It wouldn't be right to speak ill of the firm, not now." She turned away, rearranging a stack of tins with unnecessary care. Miss Marple's expression remained kind, but her mind was alert. Clara's reluctance was not mere loyalty. It was protective, as if shielding a secret she feared to expose. "Of course, my dear," she said gently, "loyalty is a fine thing, but sometimes speaking out can lift a burden. I remember a young girl in St. Mary Mead years ago who kept silent about a theft out of loyalty, only to find it ate at her conscience." Clara's lips trembled, and she leaned closer, her voice low. "There was something," she admitted, her words halting. "A few weeks ago, I noticed discrepancies in the ledger. Small amounts, you know, but they didn't add up. I told Mr. Hawthorne, but he said it was a mistake, that Mr. Caldwell would fix it. I didn't press, it wasn't my place. eyes filled with tears, and she dabbed at them with a handkerchief. I should have said more, but I didn't want to betray him. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze soft but piercing. You did what you thought was right, she said. But those discrepancies, do you think they might have had something to do with the ledger's disappearance? Clara shook her head, her expression anguished. I don't know, I keep thinking. If I'd spoken up, maybe Mr. Hawthorne would still be alive. But I couldn't bear to think he'd suspect me of disloyalty. Her voice broke, and she turned away, busying herself with the ledger again. Miss Marple watched her, her mind sifting through the revelation. Discrepancies in the ledger, dismissed by Hawthorne but noticed by Clara, clue that pointed to financial misdeeds, perhaps the motive for both the theft and the murder. Clara's devotion to Hawthorne was genuine, but her silence suggested fear, not of guilt but of consequence. Miss Marple recalled a parlour-maid in St. Mary Mead, whose loyalty to her employer had kept her quiet about her poisoning until the truth could no longer be contained. Rising, Miss Marple tucked her knitting away and paid for the wool, her smile reassuring. You've been very kind to talk with me, Miss Finch, she said. These things weigh heavily, but the truth has a way of coming out. Do take care of yourself and your mother. She patted Clara's hand, noting the girl's trembling fingers, and stepped out into the village's bustle as she walked home. The morning air crisp and the village stirring with life. Miss Marple's thoughts were busy. Clara's alibi was solid, backed by Mrs. Price's testimony, but her knowledge of the ledger's discrepancies was a new thread in the tapestry. It pointed to someone likely Caldwell, given his role manipulating the accounts, and Hawthorne's dismissal of the issue suggested either trust or denial. Clara's devotion, Miss Marple sensed, was both her strength and her vulnerability, a shield that might hide more than it revealed. The village shop faded behind her, and Miss Marple passed the church where the vicar was tending roses. She paused to exchange pleasantries, but her mind was elsewhere, weaving together the smudge on the manor's windowsill, Caldwell's nervous denials, Blake's calculated charm, and now Clara's reluctant confession. The ledger was the heart of the crime, she was certain, and its secrets had cost Hawthorne his life. She would need to speak with Victor Grayson next, to test his grudge against the delicate balance of the other's stories. The truth, like her knitting, was taking shape, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 6. The rivals grudged the village of St. Mary Mead, basked in the golden glow of a late summer afternoon, its lanes alive with the hum of bees and the chatter of passers-by. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat shading her keen eyes, made her way toward the annual village fete, a lively affair held on the green near the church. Her ostensible purpose was to admire the flower displays and perhaps contribute a jar of her homemade damson jam to the stalls. But her true aim was to encounter Mr. Victor Grayson, the rival merchant whose feud with Reginald Hawthorne was the stuff of village legend. The fete, with its crowds and casual encounters, offered the perfect setting to observe him without arousing suspicion. The green was a riot of colour, and sound children darted between booths, their laughter mingling with the clink of teacups, and the strains of a local band playing a jaunty tune. Miss Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, moved through the throng with the quiet grace of one accustomed to blending in. She paused at a stall to compliment Mrs. Bantry's roses, her ears attuned to the snippets of gossip swirling around her. The murder and the missing ledger were on everyone's lips, and Grayson's name surfaced often, laced with speculation about his long-standing enmity with Hawthorne. She spotted Victor Grayson near the tambola, a burly man in his late 40s, his broad shoulders straining against a tweed jacket that seemed at odds with the festive mood. His face, weathered by years of outdoor work, was set in a scowl as he handed a prize to a giggling child. His booming voice carried over the crowd, gruff but not unkind, as he bantered with a neighbour about the quality of the cider. Miss Marple approached, her smile as disarming as ever, and offered a compliment on his stall's contribution to the fete. "Mr. Grayson, how good of you to support the village," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Your warehouse always provides such fine goods. It's a wonder you find time, with all the demands of business." Grayson turned, his dark eyes narrowing briefly before softening into a guarded politeness. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" "Aye. The fate's a good cause. Keeps the village ticking over. Though I reckon you're not here just for the tambola." His tone was blunt, but there was a glint of amusement in his gaze, as if he recognized her reputation for prying. Miss Marple chuckled, adjusting her hat. "Oh, I do enjoy a fete, but I confess, I've been thinking of poor Mr. Hawthorne. Such a loss for St. Mary Mead. I understand you and he had differences in business matters." Grayson's scowl returned, deepening the lines on his face. "Differences. That's a polite way of putting it. Hawthorne was a shark, Miss Marple. Cut my prices, poached my suppliers, spread rumours about my stock. His firm's been bleeding mine dry for years." He folded his arms, his voice rising. "Not that I'm shedding tears, mind you, but I didn't kill him, if that's what you're fishing for." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with gentle reproof. "Goodness, Mr. Grayson, I'm only an old woman making conversation, but it's natural for tongues to wag, especially with the police asking questions. They say you were at your warehouse." "That night I was," he said, his tone defiant, "checking inventory till late. My foreman, Jenkins, was there till 9 or so. After that, I was alone, but I have no reason to sneak about Hawthorne's manor. If I'd wanted him gone, I'd have faced him man to man, not skulked like a thief." His words were bold, but Miss Marple noted a slight hesitation, as if his confidence masked a crack in his story. She nodded, her knitting needles emerging from her bag as she settled onto a nearby bench, gesturing for him to join her. "Of course, Mr. Grayson, you strike me as a straightforward man, though I wonder about that ledger. It seems such a curious thing to steal. Did you ever deal with it in your rivalry with Mr. Hawthorne?" Grayson sat, his bulk making the bench creak. "Never saw it," he said flatly. "Hawthorne kept it close, like it was gold. But I heard whisper suppliers complaining about late payments, orders going astray. If that ledger showed his firm was shaky, I'd have used it to outbid him, not steal it. Killing him wouldn't get me my contracts back." His voice was gruff, but there was a raw honesty in it, a contrast to the polished deflections of Blake or Caldwell's nervous evasions. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her gaze drifting to the crowd, but her mind fixed on Grayson's words. His grudge was real, but his bluntness suggested a man who acted openly, not with the subtlety required to stage a locked room murder and steal a ledger. She recalled a farmer from St. Mary Mead, whose temper had led to a public brawl, but never to deceit. Grayson's alibi, however, was weak as foreman's vague recollection left hours unaccounted for, and the warehouse was close enough to the manor for a late-night visit. "You must have known Mr. Caldwell and Mr. Blake." "Too," she said, her tone conversational. "They seem such different men, yet both so tied to the firm. I suppose they had their own views on Mr. Hawthorne's methods. Grayson snorted, leaning back. Caldwell's a weasel, always scribbling in his books, jumping at shadows. Never trusted him too clever by half. Blake's another sort, all smiles and big plans. He wanted to take the firm to London, make it some grand enterprise. Hawthorne wouldn't have it, and they locked horns over it. Me, I just wanted to run my business without Hawthorne's tricks. His voice carried a bitter edge, but there was no hint of guile, only resentment. Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles pausing. It's curious, isn't it, how a business can stir such passions? I remember a grocer in St. Mary Mead, years ago, whose rivalry with a neighbour led to all sorts of mischief, though nothing so grave as this. Do you think someone else might have had a reason to take that ledger, Mr. Grayson? He shrugged, his eyes scanning the fate. Could be anyone who knew what it held. Money makes people do mad things, but I'll tell you, this Hawthorne wasn't the saint the village makes him out to be. He had enemies, and not just me. He stood, brushing off his jacket. I've got to get back to the stall. Good talking, Miss Marple, but don't go thinking I'm your man. I've got enough troubles, without a noose round my neck. Miss Marple smiled, tucking her knitting away. Thank you, Mr. Grayson. You've been most forthcoming. Enjoy the fate. She watched him stride off, his heavy steps scattering gravel, and her mind turned over his words. His grudge was clear, but his temperament seemed ill-suited to the calculated nature of the crime. The ledger's theft required finesse, not the bluster of a man like Grayson. Yet his weak alibi and proximity to the manor kept him in the frame. A rough edge in the puzzle she was piecing together as she wandered. The fate, pausing to admire a display of dahlias. Miss Marple's thoughts wove together the threads she'd gathered. Caldwell's nervousness, Blake's ambition, Clara's devotion, and now Grayson's grudged suspect offered a motive, but none quite fit the crime's precision. The smudge on the windowsill, the forced drawer, the clean pistol they pointed to someone with access and cunning. Grayson's honesty, she sensed, was his defense, but honesty could mask as well as reveal. She stopped at a tea tent, where Mrs. Bantry joined her, eager to share the latest rumours. They're saying Grayson threatened Hawthorne at the market last month, Mrs. Bantry whispered, her eyes gleaming. Said he'd ruin him if he didn't back off. Do you think he could have done it, Jane? Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene. People say many things, Dolly, but actions speak louder. Mr. Grayson is a man of passion, but passion alone doesn't steal a ledger or stage a murder. She did not elaborate, but her mind was already planning her next move. The threads were tightening, and she would need to revisit the manor. Perhaps speak with Mrs. Hawthorne again, to test the pattern emerging in her mind. The fate's music played on, but for Miss Marple, the real melody was the quiet rhythm of truth, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 7. Threads of Deception. The soft glow of twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a hush that belied the undercurrent of unease still rippling from Reginald Hawthorne's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy parlour, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls as her knitting needles moved with their familiar, meditative rhythm. Her mind, however, was far from idle, weaving together the strands of evidence and suspicion she had gathered from her encounters with Ernest Caldwell, Lionel Blake, Clara Finch, and Victor Grayson. Each suspect had offered a piece of the puzzle, but the missing ledger and the locked room murder remained tantalizingly out of reach. Like a pattern half-formed in her intricate LACEWORK, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the Manor's study, the open window, the forced drawer, the smudge on the sill. These were not random details, but deliberate clues, left by a hand both cunning and desperate. The ledger's absence pointed to financial secrets, and Clara's hesitant admission of discrepancies suggested someone had been tampering with the accounts. Caldwell, with his nervous tics and intimate knowledge of the firm's books, was the obvious suspect, but Blake's ambition and Grayson's grudge could not be dismissed. Even Clara's fierce loyalty might conceal a deeper truth. Miss Marple knew from long experience that the quietest villages hid the darkest motives, and St. Mary Mead was no exception. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. Lily, her maid, ushered in Dr. Haydock, the village physician, his face ruddy from the evening chill. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, settling into an armchair with a sigh. "Thought I'd drop by after my rounds. The Hawthorne business has the whole village in a tizzy. You've been poking about, haven't you?" His tone was teasing, but his eyes held a spark of curiosity. Knowing her knack for unraveling mysteries, Miss Marple smiled, setting her knitting aside. "I've only been offering condolences, Doctor, as any neighbour would, but I confess the affair is puzzling. A ledger doesn't vanish without reason, and poor Mr. Hawthorne's death suggests someone had a great deal to hide." Haydock nodded, his expression turning serious. "You're right about that. I examined the body, you know. Single gunshot to the temple, clean and close. Looked like suicide at first, but the angle was wrong. Someone stood over him, and no powder burns on. His hands, the police are stumped, but I wager you've got a theory or two." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but she remained non-committal. "Theories are like my knitting. Doctor, they need the right stitches to hold together. Tell me, have you heard anything about the firm's finances? Mr. Caldwell, for instance. He strike you as a man living within his means?" Haydock leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Funny you should ask. Just last week, I saw Caldwell at the chemist's, buying a fancy new watch gold, engraved, far too fine for an accountant. Salary. Struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it till now. If he was dipping into the firm's funds, that ledger would have shown it, wouldn't it?" Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind filing away the detail. "Indeed, it would," she said softly. "People often betray themselves with small extravagances. I remember a curate in St. Mary Mead, years ago, who bought a new bicycle far beyond his means. It turned out he'd been pilfering from the church collection." She paused, her thoughts returning to the manor. "I think I must see the study again, Doctor. Sometimes the smallest things a mark, a misplaced books, speak louder than words." Haydock offered to accompany her, citing a need to check on Mrs. Hawthorne's health, and the two set out for the manor as dusk deepened into night. The village was quiet, save for the distant bark of a dog and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Hawthorne Manor loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly, and Miss Marple noted the air of watchfulness about the place, as if it guarded its secrets. Jealously, Mrs. Hawthorne received them in the drawing-room, her face pale but composed. She seemed relieved by Dr. Haydock's presence, though her eyes flickered nervously toward Miss Marple. "You're very kind to call again," she said, her hands twisting a black ribbon. "The house feels so empty without Reginald." Miss Marple offered a sympathetic nod, then mentioned her wish to see the study, claiming a sentimental need to picture Mr. Hawthorne in his element. Mrs. Hawthorne hesitated, then agreed, leading them through the dimly lit hall. The study was much as Miss Marple remembered: papers scattered, the desk drawer splintered, the chalk outline a grim reminder of the crime. But in the evening light, new details emerged. The fireplace, cold and ashy, bore a faint smear on its hearth, as if something had been swept away. The bookshelf, still disordered, showed a gap where a single volume was missing, its neighbours leaning slightly to fill the space. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the window, its sill catching the lamplight. The smudge she'd noticed before was clearer, now a waxy streak, tinged with black, consistent with shoe polish. She bent closer, her fingers hovering but not touching. "Curious," she murmured, her voice low. "This mark is rather high. For a casual brush, someone climbed through, perhaps someone who knew the house well." Dr. Haydock raised an eyebrow. "You think the killer came from inside?" The police assumed an outsider, with the window open. Miss Marple straightened, her expression serene but her mind racing. An outsider would leave more traces: mud, broken twigs. "This feels familiar. Someone who could move through the house unnoticed." She glanced at Mrs. Hawthorne, who stood by the door, her face taut. "Did Mr. Hawthorne often work late, my dear, with others present?" "Sometimes," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ernest Mr. Caldwell would stay to go over the accounts. Reginald trusted him implicitly." Her words were careful, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor, a hint of doubt beneath the surface. As they returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. The smudge, the missing book, Caldwell's extravagant watch, they pointed to a financial motive, with the accountant at the center. Yet Blake's ambition, Clara's knowledge of discrepancies, and Grayson's grudge lingered in her mind, each a thread that refused to be neatly tied. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen letter had been hidden in plain sight, its absence unnoticed until the right question was asked. The ledger, she suspected, was either destroyed or hidden by someone with intimate access to the manor. Thanking Mrs. Hawthorne, Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock took their leave, the night air cool against their faces. As they walked back to the village, Haydock chuckled. "You're like a bloodhound, Jane. That window smudge, what do you make of it?" Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her shawl. "It's a small thing, Doctor, but small things matter. Like a loose stitch in a sweater, it can unravel the whole pattern. I think our killer was someone who knew the manor's ways, someone who could climb a window without leaving a mess." She did not mention Caldwell by name, but her thoughts circled him, his nervousness now cast in a sharper light. Back in her parlour, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the fire crackling softly. The threads of deception were tightening Caldwell's extravagance, the smudged sill, the ledger's secrets. She would need to speak with Mrs. Hawthorne again, perhaps probe Clara further, to test the weight of their silences. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the quiet details of St. Mary Mead's shadowed corners, and she would find it with the patience of a knitter crafting a flawless seam. Chapter 8. The widow's burden. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, weaving a delicate veil round the cottages and lending an air of quiet mystery to the village. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, sat in her garden, a cup of tea cooling on the wrought iron table beside her. Her knitting lay untouched, for her mind was too occupied with the threads of the Hawthorne case to settle on such mundane tasks. The smudge on the manor's windowsill, Ernest Caldwell's extravagant watch, Clara Finch's hesitant confession of ledger discrepancies, Lionel Blake's calculated charm, and Victor Grayson's blunt resentment all swirled in her thoughts. each a piece of a pattern that was beginning to take shape. Yet the heart of the mystery, she sensed, lay not only with the suspects, but with the woman closest to the victim, Mrs. Beatrice Hawthorne. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple decided to call on the widow again, this time without the pretext of scones or condolences. She chose a direct approach, trusting that Beatrice's grief might loosen her guard and reveal what she had so far withheld. As she walked toward Hawthorne Manor, the village waking around her with the clatter of milk bottles and the chatter of early risers, Miss Marple noted the subtle signs of a Nisa curtain twitching at Mrs. Price's cottage. A hurried glance from the postman. The murder had unsettled St. Mary Mead, and the missing ledger cast a shadow longer than the church spire at the manor. The same pale housemaid admitted her, her eyes darting nervously as she led Miss Marple to the drawing-room. Beatrice Hawthorne was seated by the window, her black morning dress absorbing the light, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked older than before, her auburn hair dulled by grief, her face etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights. Yet there was a resilience in her posture, a quiet strength that Miss Marple recognized from other women who had borne great losses. "Good morning, Mrs. Hawthorne," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm as she took a seat opposite. "I hope I'm not intruding. I've been thinking of you, alone in this great house, and I wondered if I might offer a listening ear. Sometimes sharing a burden lightens it." Beatrice's lips curved in a faint, weary smile. "You're very kind, Miss Marple. It's been difficult. The police, the questions, the endless whispers in the village. I feel as if I'm under a microscope." Her fingers tightened on a lace handkerchief, its edges frayed from constant twisting. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but watchful. "It's a trying time, to be sure, and the loss of that ledger must add to your worries. I understand it was the lifeblood of the firm. Did Mr. Hawthorne ever share its contents with you, perhaps in passing?" Beatrice hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window where the mist clung to the garden's roses. "Reginald was private about the business," she said at last. "He said it was no place for a wife's concerns, but I knew he was troubled lately. He'd stay up late in the study, poring over that ledger, muttering about figures not adding up. I thought it was just his way always, so meticulous, but now—" Her voice trailed off, and she pressed the handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "It must have been distressing, seeing him so preoccupied. Did he mention anyone in particular? Mr. Caldwell, perhaps, or Mr. Blake? They worked so closely with him." Beatrice's eyes flickered, a shadow of unease crossing her face. "Ernest Mr. Caldwell was often here, late at night. They'd go over the accounts together, sometimes arguing. Reginald trusted him, but I wondered if he trusted too much. Ernest was always so clever with numbers, finding ways to make things balance. Reginald called it a gift." Her words carried a faint edge, as if the compliment concealed a doubt. Miss Marple's mind seized on the phrase, finding ways to make things balance. It echoed Clara's mention of discrepancies, and Dr. Haydock's observation of Caldwell's extravagant watch. She recalled a St. Mary Mead grocer, long ago, whose clever bookkeeping had hidden debts until a single receipt betrayed him. "A gift for numbers is a fine thing," she said, her voice mild, though sometimes cleverness can lead one astray. "Did you ever see the ledger yourself, Mrs. Hawthorne?" Beatrice shook her head, her fingers twisting the handkerchief tighter. "Never. Reginald kept it locked in his desk, or with Ernest. I only knew it was important because he guarded it so fiercely. When I heard it was gone, I thought, perhaps someone wanted to hide something. Her voice dropped to a whisper, and she glanced toward the door, as if fearing EAVESDROPPERS. Miss Marple followed her glance, noting the quiet of the house. The servants moved softly, their presence barely felt, yet she sensed an undercurrent of watchfulness. "It's a curious thing, a ledger vanishing like that," she said, almost as if it held a secret worth killing for. "Did Mr. Hawthorne ever speak of enemies, my dear? Mr. Grayson, perhaps, or even Mr. Blake?" Beatrice's lips tightened, and for a moment she seemed to weigh her words. Victor Grayson was no friend, that's certain. Reginald outmaneuvered him in business, and Victor never forgave him. There were threats, nothing direct, but angry words at the market. As for Lionel, Mr. Blake, he and Reginald clashed over the firm's future. Lionel wanted to expand, to take risks. Reginald thought it reckless. They argued, but I never thought. She stopped, her eyes filling with tears. Miss Marple reached out, patting her hand gently. There, my dear. It's hard to think ill of those we know, but sometimes those closest to us carry the heaviest burdens." She paused, letting the silence work its gentle pressure. "Did you notice anything unusual that night, Mrs. Hawthorne? A sound, a visitor, perhaps?" Beatrice's hand stilled, and her gaze dropped to the floor. "It was a quiet night," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was upstairs, reading. I heard Reginald in the study, pacing as he often did. Then a noise, like a muffled thud, but I thought it was just the house settling. I didn't know until the maid screamed." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in the handkerchief. Miss Marple's expression remained kind, but her mind was racing. A muffled thud, consistent with a silenced pistol or a heavy object falling. The study's locked door, an open window, suggested someone had entered or exited stealthily, and Beatrice's vague account left room for doubt. Was she withholding out of fear, grief, or something deeper? Miss Marple thought of a widow in St. Mary Mead years ago, whose silence about her husband's death had hidden not guilt but shame over his debts. Rising, Miss Marple smoothed her skirt, her smile reassuring. "You've been very brave, Mrs. Hawthorne, sharing so much. I'll not keep you longer. But do rest, and know that the truth will come out, as it always does." She moved toward the door, pausing to glance at a small table where a vase of wilting roses stood. Beside it lay a single glove, black and finely made, its partner missing. An odd detail, she thought, filing it away with the smudge on the sill and the forced drawer. As she stepped into the misty morning, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. Beatrice's burden was not just grief but knowledge, perhaps of Caldwell's manipulations, or Blake's ambitions, or even something closer to home. The glove, the thud, the ledger's secrets, they were threads in a tapestry growing clearer. She recalled a case where a single misplaced item, a scarf, much like the glove had, led to a servant's confession of theft. The manor held more clues, she was certain, and she would need to return. Perhaps with Inspector Craddock, to test her suspicions. The village bustled around her as she walked home. Children playing on the green, the baker's cart rattling past. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, stitching together the widow's words with the evidence of the study. Caldwell's cleverness, Beatrice's doubts, the missing glove, they pointed to a crime rooted in trust betrayed. The truth was near. She felt hidden in the quiet spaces of St. Mary Mead, and she would unravel it with the patience of a knitter perfecting a delicate pattern. Chapter 9. The Ledger's Secret. The quiet of St. Mary Mead's Sunday morning was broken only by the tolling of the church bell, its solemn notes drifting over the village like a call to reflection. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual pew, her prayer book open but her eyes wandering, not to the stained glass windows but to the faces of her neighbours. The village was still abuzz with whispers of Reginald Hawthorne's murder and the missing ledger, and Miss Marple's thoughts were fixed on the threads she had gathered: Ernest Caldwell's nervous extravagance, Lionel Blake's calculated ambition, Clara Finch's reluctant admission of ledger discrepancies, Victor Grayson's blunt grudge, and Beatrice Hawthorne's burdened silences. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the heart of it, the ledger's secret, was beginning to emerge, and Miss Marple knew the church, with its gathering of souls, might yield the next clue. As the service ended, Miss Marple lingered near the churchyard, her black shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her knitting bag at her side. She exchanged pleasantries with the vicar, her eyes scanning the congregation for Clara Finch. The young clerk stood apart, her plain coat and hat making her nearly invisible among the brighter Sunday attire. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed, as if the weight of her secret had grown heavier since their talk at the village shop. Miss Marple approached, her smile as gentle as the morning light. "Good morning, Miss Finch," she said, her voice soft but carrying a quiet authority. "A lovely service, wasn't it? Though I imagine your thoughts are elsewhere, with all that's happened at the firm." Clara started, her hands clutching her hymn book. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes. It's been hard to focus. The firm, Mr. Hawthorne, the ledger, it's all so overwhelming." Her voice trembled, and she glanced around, as if fearing eavesdroppers. Among the gravestones, Miss Marple nodded, guiding Clara to a bench beneath an ancient yew tree, its branches casting dappled shadows. "It's a heavy burden, my dear, knowing something that might help. I've been thinking about what you told me, those discrepancies in the ledger. It must have troubled you, seeing such things and feeling unable to act." Clara's eyes widened, her fingers tightening on the hymn book. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered. "I saw the figures, small amounts, moved around, not quite right. I showed them to Mr. Hawthorne, but he said it was a clerical error, that Mr. Caldwell would sort it out. I trusted him, but I kept noticing things. Payments to suppliers that didn't match, sums that vanished. I thought I was wrong, but now, with the ledger gone," her voice broke and she looked away, her shoulders hunching. Miss Marple knitting emerged, the soft click of needles a soothing counterpoint to Clara's distress. "You did right to speak to Mr. Hawthorne," she said gently, "but it sounds as if those discrepancies were no mistake. Did you ever see Mr. Caldwell working on the ledger alone, perhaps making changes?" Clara hesitated, her gaze fixed on the ground. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "A few times, late in the evening. He'd stay after I left, saying he needed to balance the books. Once, I came back for my shawl and saw him at the desk, scribbling furiously, his face so pale. I didn't think much of it then, but now, I wonder if he was hiding something." Her eyes filled with tears, and she dabbed at them with a handkerchief. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind seizing on the image of Caldwell alone, with the ledger, his agitation a stark contrast to his usual nervous precision. It dovetailed with Dr. Haydock's mention of the extravagant watch, Beatrice's doubts about Caldwell's cleverness, and the smudge on the manor's windowsill. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a trusted clerk had siphoned funds from a parish account his guilt betrayed by late-night work and a sudden taste for fine clothes. "It's a terrible thing, suspecting someone you work with," she said softly. "But sometimes the truth lies in what we fear to face." Did Mr. Hawthorne ever confront Mr. Caldwell about these discrepancies? Clara shook her head, her expression anguished. "Not that I know. He trusted Ernest, said he was the best accountant he'd ever had. But the last week, Mr. Hawthorne was different. He'd lock the ledger in his desk, check it himself at night. I heard him arguing with someone in the study, a man's voice, but I couldn't tell who. I was afraid to ask." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "If I'd spoken up sooner, maybe he'd still be alive." Miss Marple reached out, patting Clara's hand. "You mustn't blame yourself, my dear. You acted out of loyalty, and that's no small thing. But this argument, when did you hear it?" "A few days before." "Before it happened," Clara said, her eyes distant. "It was late, and I'd stayed to finish some letters." The voices were muffled, but Mr. Hawthorne sounded angry, saying something about proof and not letting it stand. "I left quickly. I didn't want to pry." She shivered, pulling her coat tighter. Miss Marple's mind raced, the pieces falling into place. An argument about proof, the ledger's disappearance, Caldwell's late-night scribbling, these pointed to embezzlement, with Hawthorne growing suspicious. The smudge on the sill, the forced drawer, the clean pistol, they suggested a desperate act to silence the truth. But was Caldwell alone in his guilt, or had another Blake, perhaps, with his ambition, played a role? She thought of a St. Mary Mead seamstress, whose whispered confession had unraveled a theft ring, her fear of betrayal mirroring Clara's. Rising, Miss Marple smiled reassuringly. "You've been very brave, Miss Finch. What you've told me may help more than you know. Do try to rest and leave the worrying to others for now." She watched Clara walk away, her steps heavy, and turned toward home, her thoughts a tangle of new insights. As she passed the village green, Miss Marple paused to watch children playing, their laughter a stark contrast to the darkness she was unraveling. Clara's revelation confirmed her suspicions of financial misconduct, with Caldwell as the likely culprit. Yet the argument Clara overheard suggested Hawthorne had confronted someone, and the ledger's theft indicated a need to destroy evidence. The glove in Beatrice's drawing room, the smudged sill, the missing book from the study shelf, these were clues to a crime planned with care, by someone intimate with the manor's ways. Back in her parlour, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The ledger's secret was clear. It held proof of embezzlement, likely by Caldwell, whose nervous demeanour and extravagant purchase now seemed damning. But the murder required nerve, and she wondered if Caldwell's agitation masked a killer's resolve, or if another hand Blake's perhaps had pulled the trigger. She recalled a village doctor, years ago, whose quiet demeanour hid a ruthless streak, uncovered only when a single clue, misplaced syringe, broke the case. The church bell tolled noon, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to her next step. She would need to consult Inspector Craddock, perhaps suggest a closer look at Caldwell's office, where traces of the ledger's fate might linger. The truth was close, she felt, hidden in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead, and she would draw it out with the patience of a knitter untangling a stubborn knot. Chapter 10. The trap is set. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting intricate shadows on the polished floorboards. Her knitting lay abandoned on the table, the needles silent for once. As her mind wove together the threads of the Hawthorne case, with a precision honed by years of unraveling village secrets. The smudge on the manor's windowsill, Ernest Caldwell's extravagant watch, Clara Finch's revelation of ledger discrepancies, Lionel Blake's calculated ambition, Victor Grayson's blunt grudge, and Beatrice Hawthorne's burdened silences all pointed to a crime rooted in financial deceit. The ledger, Miss Marple was certain, held proof of embezzlement, and its theft was no mere afterthought but the motive for Reginald Hawthorne's murder. Now, with the pattern clear, she needed to draw the culprit into the open dot. Miss Marple's plan was simple yet daring, inspired by a case in St. Mary Mead where a rumour of a found letter had flushed out a thief. She telephoned Inspector Craddock, her voice calm but insistent, and proposed a stratagem. Spread word that the missing ledger had been discovered, hidden in the manor's attic, and would be examined the following day. The news, she reasoned, would unsettle the guilty party, prompting them to act, perhaps to retrieve or destroy the evidence before it could be scrutinized. Craddock, though initially skeptical, agreed, trusting her instincts after past successes. "You're a sly one, Miss Marple," he said, a note of admiration in his voice. "But I'll play along. Let's see who takes the bait." The plan was set in motion with the subtlety of a village whisper. Miss Marple enlisted Mrs. Bantry, whose knack for gossip was unmatched, to mention the ledger's discovery at the post office, where it would spread like wildfire. By evening, the rumour had reached the Blue Boar Inn, the village shop, and even the vicarage, each retelling, embellishing the tale. The ledger, found in a dusty trunk, was said to hold secrets that would shock the village. Miss Marple, sipping tea in her parlour, smiled faintly. The trap was laid, and now she would watch. That night, under the cover of darkness, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock took their positions near Hawthorne Manor. Craddock had stationed 2 constables in the shadows of the garden, their presence concealed by the thick yew hedges. Miss Marple, wrapped in a dark shawl, stood by a side gate, her small figure blending into the night. The manor loomed before them, its windows dark save for a faint glow from Beatrice's upstairs room. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and roses, and Miss Marple's senses were alert, attuned to the slightest sound. Hours passed, the village clock chiming midnight, then 1. Miss Marple's patience, honed by years of knitting intricate patterns, held firm. Then a faint rustle broke the silence, a shadow moving along the manor's west wall, near the study window. Her heart quickened, but she remained still, her eyes straining in the moonlight. The figure, slight and cautious, paused at the window, its latch glinting as it was eased open. A moment later, the shadow slipped inside, silent as a cat. Craddock, hidden nearby, signalled to his men, but Miss Marple raised a hand, urging restraint. "Let him search," she whispered. "He'll betray himself." They waited, the seconds, stretching until a faint clatter echoed from the study. A drawer opened, papers rustled. Then a muffled curse, sharp and desperate. Craddock nodded, and the constables moved, their footsteps soft but swift. They entered the manor through a side door, Miss Marple following at a discreet distance. The study was dimly lit by a single lamp, and there, hunched over the desk, was Ernest Caldwell, his spectacles glinting as he rifled through papers. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he searched frantically, unaware of the figures closing in. Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm. "Mr. Caldwell, that's enough. Step away from the desk." Caldwell froze, his eyes wide with panic. I was just checking something," he stammered, his voice high and thin. I heard the ledger was found, and I thought I needed to see it. His satchel lay open on the floor, a small crowbar beside it, its tip matching the splinters on the desk drawer from the night of the murder. Miss Marple stepped into the light, her expression serene but her gaze piercing. "You were looking for the ledger, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, "because you knew what it contained, proof of your embezzlement, I presume." Caldwell's knees buckled, and he sank into the chair, his hands covering his face. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he whispered. "I took money, yes, small amounts, to cover debts. I was going to pay it back." But Reginald started, asking questions, checking the ledger himself. "I couldn't let him find out." His voice broke, and he looked up, his eyes pleading. "I stole the ledger, burned it in my fireplace. But I didn't kill him, I swear it." Craddock's face hardened, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, catching the faint smudge of black polish on Caldwell's shoes, matching the mark on the windowsill. "You climbed through this window before, didn't you?" she asked, her tone deceptively mild. "The night Mr. Hawthorne died. The smudge on the sill, the force to draw it, was you trying to cover your tracks." Caldwell shook his head, his voice rising. "No, I took the ledger, yes, but I didn't shoot him. I left through the window, but he was alive when I left." His words tumbled out, desperate and disjointed, but Miss Marple's mind was already testing his claim against the evidence. The clean pistol, the locked room, the muffled thud Beatrice had heard, they suggested a calculated act, not a panicked theft. Craddock signalled to the constables, who took Caldwell by the arms. "You'll have to come with us, Mr. Caldwell," he said. "We'll sort out the truth at the station." As they led him away, Caldwell's protests echoed through the hall, his satchel left behind like a confession. Miss Marple lingered in the study, her eyes tracing the familiar scene, the scattered papers, the open window, the smudged sill. Caldwell's confession to the theft was damning, but his denial of the murder rang hollow. The smudge, the crowbar, his late-night presence day, pointed to guilt, yet something nagged at her, a loose thread in the pattern. She thought of a St. Mary Mead baker, whose partial confession to theft had masked a deeper crime, uncovered only when a second witness stepped forward as she walked home through the quiet village. The stars bright overhead, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. Caldwell was the key, but was he the only one? Blake's ambition, Clara's silence, Beatrice's unease, they lingered in her mind, suggesting layers yet to be unravelled. The trap had caught its prey, but the full truth, she sensed, was still hidden, waiting for one final tug to bring it into the light. Chapter 11. The Final Confession. The dawn light crept over St. Mary Mead, painting the rooftops with a soft gold that belied the grim proceedings unfolding at the village police station. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl wrapped tightly against the morning chill, sat in Inspector Craddock's small office, a cup of tea untouched before her. The events of the previous night turned Caldwell's desperate search in the Manor's study. His panicked confession to stealing and burning the ledger had tightened the net around the accountant, but Miss Marple's mind was not yet at rest. The smudge of shoe polish on the windowsill, the forced desk drawer, and Caldwell's trembling denial of murder formed a pattern, but a single thread remained loose, nagging at her like a dropped stitch in her knitting. Craddock, his face lined with fatigue, paced the office, his notebook open on the desk. "We've got him, Miss Marple," he said, his voice firm but tinged with frustration. Caldwell admitted to embezzling thousands from Hawthorne and Sons. Small sums at first, then larger as he got bolder. He burned the ledger to hide the evidence. But he swears he didn't kill Hawthorne, says he left him alive that night. I'm not sure I buy it. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, met his. He's told us part of the truth, Inspector, but not all. People like Mr. Caldwell often confess just enough to ease their conscience, hoping to obscure the rest. I remember a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper years ago who admitted to shortchanging customers but denied poisoning a rival until the evidence was undeniable. She paused, her fingers brushing the edge of her shawl. We must press him further. Craddock nodded, gesturing for her to follow him to the interrogation room. A stark space with bare walls and a single table where Caldwell sat, his hands cuffed, his spectacles askew. He looked diminished, his wiry frame slumped, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. When he saw Miss Marple, his expression flickered with something between fear and resignation. Mr. Caldwell, Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but unyielding. You've told us about the ledger, and that was brave. But there's more to this story, isn't there? The night Mr. Hawthorne died, you were in the study, climbing through the window. The smudge of polish on the sill, the crowbar in your satchel, all points to you. Yet you say you didn't kill him. Help us understand. Caldwell's hands trembled, and he adjusted his spectacles, a nervous tic that Miss Marple noted with quiet interest. I told you, he said, his voice high and strained. I took the ledger, yes. I climbed through the window. Reginald had locked the door, and I couldn't let him see me. He was alive when I left, I swear it. I took the ledger and ran. I burned it at home, in my fireplace. I didn't want him dead, just the evidence gone. Craddock leaned forward, his tone sharp. And we're to believe you just happened to steal the ledger the same night someone shot him. No fingerprints on the pistol, a locked room, and you creeping about like a thief. It doesn't look good, Caldwell. Caldwell's face crumpled, tears welling behind his spectacles. I know how it looks, he whispered, but I didn't shoot him. I heard him pacing, muttering about the accounts. He'd been checking the ledger himself, asking questions. I panicked. I thought if I took it, he'd have no proof. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was relentless, sifting through his words. The smudge, the crowbar, the burned ledger, they confirmed. His theft, but the murder required more. She thought of Beatrice's muffled thud, Clara's overheard argument, the clean pistol. Mr. Caldwell, she said, her voice as calm as a summer stream, you say Mr. Hawthorne was alive when you left, but someone entered that study after you, someone who knew the house well enough to move silently, to leave no trace. Did you see anyone else that night? Hear anything? Caldwell's eyes widened, a flicker of memory crossing his face. I heard footsteps as I climbed out, light ones, in the hall. I thought it was a servant, so I hurried away. I didn't look back. His voice shook, and he buried his face in his hands. I should have stayed, should have warned him, but I was afraid. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Craddock, her mind racing. Footsteps in the hall, someone else in the manor, unnoticed. By Beatrice upstairs. The glove in the drawing room, the missing book from the study shelf, these suggested a second presence, someone with access and motive. But Caldwell's panic seemed genuine, his tears those of a man overwhelmed by guilt. Not cunning. She recalled a St. Mary Mead gardener, whose tearful confession to theft had stopped short of admitting arson, until a neighbour's testimony sealed his fate. Craddock pressed harder. his voice like a hammer. "If you didn't kill him, Caldwell, who did? You're the one with the motive, the means, the opportunity. That smudge on the sill matches your shoe polish our men checked. You expect us to believe someone else conveniently showed up to finish the job." Caldwell's head snapped up, his voice breaking. "It wasn't me. I stole, yes, I admit it. I took thousands debts, gambling, I couldn't stop. Reginald was closing in, demanding the ledger. I had to take it. But I didn't have a gun. I didn't shoot him." His words dissolved into sobs, and he slumped forward, his spectacles slipping down his nose. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her thoughts crystallizing. The smudge was Caldwell's, the theft his doing, but the murders, precision, the wiped pistol. The locked room suggested a steadier hand. She leaned forward, her voice soft but piercing. "Mr. Caldwell, when you took the ledger, was the desk drawer already forced, or did you break it open?" He blinked, his tears pausing. I used the crowbar. It was locked, and I didn't have the key. I was careful, quiet. Reginald didn't hear me." Miss Marple nodded, her mind locking onto the detail. The drawer was forced by Caldwell, but the pistol was clean, the room undisturbed beyond the theft. Someone else had entered, someone who knew Hawthorne's habits, who could shoot and stage a suicide without leaving a trace. Blake's ambition, Clara's loyalty, Beatrice's unease, they flickered in her mind. But Caldwell's desperation held the key. Craddock, sensing her intent, pushed further. "You're facing a noose, Caldwell. If you're innocent of murder, tell us everything. Who else might have wanted Hawthorne dead? Blake, Grayson." Caldwell's sobs quieted, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I don't know. Blake wanted control, always pushing for more. Grayson hated him, but he's not the sneaking type. I just wanted the ledger gone. I didn't mean for this." He broke down again, and Craddock signaled to a constable to take him back to his cell. As Caldwell was led away, Miss Marple sat back, her fingers brushing her shawl. "He's guilty of theft, Inspector," she said quietly, "but I believe him about the murder. The footsteps he heard, the clean pistol, they point to another hand. Someone who waited, who knew Caldwell's theft would cover their tracks." Rubbed his chin, his skepticism softening. "You're saying we've got two culprits. Caldwell steals the ledger, and someone else takes advantage to kill Hawthorne." "Exactly," Miss Marple said, her eyes gleaming. "The murder was planned, Inspector, by someone who knew the manor's rhythms, who could enter and leave unseen. The glove in the drawing room, the missing books, small things, but they matter. We must look closer at those closest to the house." Craddock nodded, his respect for her growing. "I'll have the manor searched again, and we'll question Mrs. Hawthorne and Miss Finch more closely. You've got a knack for this, Miss Marple. If there's another killer, we'll find them." As Miss Marple stepped into the morning light, the village waking around her, she felt the puzzle nearing completion. Caldwell's confession had unraveled the ledger's fate, but the murder's true architect remained hidden, their shadow cast in the manor's silent corners. She thought of a St. Mary Mead widow, whose quiet tears had masked a deeper betrayal, revealed only when a single clue, hidden letter, broke the case. The truth, she knew, was close, and she would find it with the patience of a knitter mending a final seam. Chapter 12. The village restored. The soft September light bathed St. Mary Mead in a gentle glow, as if the village itself were exhaling after the storm of Reginald Hawthorne's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlour window, her knitting needles resuming their familiar rhythm, the soft click-clack, a counterpoint to the quiet hum of the village beyond. The arrest of Ernest Caldwell had sent ripples through St. Mary Mead, but the final piece of the puzzle, his confession to embezzlement, but not to murder, had left Miss Marple restless. The smudge on the window sill, the clean pistol, the muffled thud Beatrice heard, and the footsteps Caldwell recalled in the hall pointed to a second hand, one that had orchestrated the murder with chilling precision. Now, with the truth laid bare, the village could begin to heal. But Miss Marple's work was not yet done. The previous evening, after Caldwell's tearful confession, Miss Marple had returned to Hawthorne Manor with Inspector Craddock, her mind fixed on the glove in the drawing-room and the missing book from the study shelf. These small details, overlooked by others, were to her like stray threads in a tapestry, demanding attention. In the Manor's drawing-room, she had examined the glove again, a single black leather glove, finely made, its partner absent. It was too small for a man's hand, she noted, and its presence near Beatrice's roses suggested a connection to the household's inner circle. Inspector, she had said, her voice calm but firm, we must consider those closest to Mr. Hawthorne. The footsteps Mr. Caldwell heard, the glove, the book missing from the shelf. They suggest someone intimate with the manor, someone who could move unnoticed. Mrs. Hawthorne was upstairs that night, but we've not fully explored her. Account. Craddock, though weary, had agreed to question Beatrice again, and they found her in the drawing-room, her face pale but composed. Under Miss Marple's gentle probing, Beatrice's composure began to crack. I told you everything, she insisted, her hands twisting the familiar laced handkerchief. I heard a thud, nothing more. I was reading, upstairs, alone, but Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as her needles, caught the flicker of fear in Beatrice's gaze. My dear, she said softly, you mentioned Mr. Caldwell's cleverness with numbers, and your husband's growing suspicion. Did you ever suspect what he was hiding? Or perhaps, did you know more than you've said? Beatrice's hands stilled, and for a moment the room was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Then, with a sob, she broke. Knew? She whispered. I knew Ernest was stealing. Reginald told me the day before he died. He found proof in the ledger sums missing, accounts altered. He was going to confront Ernest, have him arrested. I begged him to wait, to think of the scandal, but he wouldn't listen. Her voice trembled, and she buried her face in her hands. Miss Marple's expression remained kind, but her mind was racing. And that night, Mrs. Hawthorne, when you heard the thud, did you go to the study? Beatrice's eyes widened, her breath catching. I did. I went downstairs, quietly. I saw Ernest climbing out the window, the ledger in his hands. I thought he'd come to steal it, to cover his tracks. But Reginald was alive, sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. I went back upstairs, afraid to interfere. Then, later, I heard the shot. Her voice broke, and she collapsed into tears. Craddock's face hardened, but Miss Marple pressed on, her voice steady. And the glove, my dear, the one in this room, without its pair. Did you wear it that night, perhaps? When you returned to the study? Beatrice froze, her tears stopping as if a tap had been turned. I don't know what you mean, she stammered, but her eyes darted to the glove. Betraying her, Miss Marple's voice was gentle but relentless. You went back, didn't you? After Caldwell left, you returned to the study. You had the pistol one Reginald kept in the house. You shot him, staged it as a suicide, and took a book from the shelf to make it seem a robbery gone wrong. The glove was left behind, a small mistake. Beatrice's face crumpled, and she sank to her knees, her confession spilling out like a dam breaking. "I couldn't let him ruin us," she sobbed. "The scandal, the chemise, would have destroyed the firm, our name, everything. I thought if Ernest took the ledger, it would be enough, but Reginald was going to the police. I took his gun from the drawer upstairs. I waited until Ernest was gone, then I shot him. I wiped the pistol, locked the door, and left through the window. I didn't mean for it to come to this." Her sobs filled the room, a raw outpouring of guilt and despair. Craddock, stunned but swift, called for a constable to take Beatrice into custody. As she was led away, her head bowed, Miss Marple watched with a quiet sadness. She thought of a St. Mary Mead wife, years ago, whose desperate act to protect her family had led to a betrayal uncovered by a single misplaced hairpin. Beatrice's love for her husband's legacy had twisted into a fatal choice, her loyalty, as much a motive as Caldwell's greed. Now, in her parlour, Miss Marple reflected on the case's resolution. Caldwell's arrest for embezzlement and Beatrice's for murder had closed the circle, restoring balance to St. Mary Mead. Clara Finch, shaken but resolute, had taken over the firm's accounts, her quiet competence a new foundation for Hawthorne and Sons. Lionel Blake, his ambitions tempered by the scandal, moved forward with cautious plans for expansion, while Victor Grayson's rivalry faded into a grudging truce. The village, like Miss Marple's knitting, had its pattern restored, each stitch falling into place as she picked up her needles. The fire crackling softly, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the fragility of trust. Beatrice's act, born of desperation to protect her husband's name, echoed the small betrayals she had seen in St. Mary Mead over the years: maid's theft, a friend's lie, a neighbour's silence. The ledger's secret had been the spark, but human nature, with its tangle of love, fear, and greed, had lit the flame. The village bell chimed, and Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles moving once more. Another mystery had been unravelled, but she knew St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes held more secrets waiting for her watchful eye. For now, she would knit, her fingers steady, her mind ever ready for the next thread to pull.